Good morning, everybody. I'm Jay Mallin. I'm a parishioner here. My preferred pronouns are he, him, his, but they is okay too. And when I'm not attending St. John's committee meetings or Men's Chill Grill, I'm a photographer and sometimes a filmmaker. So let me explain how I ended up here today. Back in 2015, there was a diocesan book in their newsletter to be read, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, the founder of EJI and the Lynching Museum down in the other Montgomery. And if you read the book, he urged his readers to find out their local stories. So of course I put down the book and went to Google and started looking. And I looked at Google and also, I think it mentioned one or two a little bit without a lot of detail. I looked in local history books. There's a lot of really good history books with beautiful pictures of Montgomery County. They have squat on this. I mean, there's a whole book on Poolesville, and really not that much interesting has happened in Poolesville since the Civil War, but they still couldn't find room to put in the first incident we're going to talk about. And the Historical Society at the time, if you went to their online database to search the collections and typed in lynch or lynching, you'd end up with no results. That has since changed, and maybe we'll get on to that. But as it turns out, we do have very good information, well, with limits that we'll talk about, on the 3 known lynchings in Montgomery County. And that's from the newspapers at the time. This stuff was big news. It was big news. It was big news all across the country. It made the front of the New York Times. It made obscure papers in Minnesota. And within limits that we'll talk about, they do explain a lot of what happened, the characters, and as a photographer and filmmaker, what I'm most interested in, exact locations. By reading them, you can figure out what happened exactly where in the modern day county. And needless to say, at the moment there are no historical markers up or anything like that to show you these places. And in this I had the help of, I was fortunate to have the help of a researcher, a librarian and genealogist from Frederick County, who also happens to be my sister. You couldn't have a better sister if you're having to do this, and she has access to census records, and we looked at property records, all kinds of stuff, as you'll see. Also, some really wonderful, beautiful maps of the time. So I'm going to try and get through these sort of in a bare bones way. There's a lot of additional color. There's a lot of details that I'm just not going to go into because we don't need it. And then we can talk about it and see what you all think. So, as I say, the sources are, here is, hey, this thing works. The New York Times from July 1880. This was the second lynching. And let's see what it says. There's 2 things I want to point out here. From the lead, the region around the city, the capital of the nation, has become notorious for the punishment of colored criminals by lynch law, and for public sentiment which supports those who in this way administer what they believe justice demands. So this is an account of the second lynching. But the other thing I want to point out, because this demonstrates it really well, is the terrible flaws in these accounts. These accounts were written by white reporters for overwhelmingly white readership, and they were out to comfort their readers. They wanted to give some details, they wanted to inform them or entertain them, as reporters do, but they also wanted to comfort their readers and make them, if you can imagine this, feel good about what happened, or relatively good. And the case in point here is this headline, "A Brutal Negro Lynched." The New York Times used this exact same headline 9 times between 1880 and 1891 on different lynchings. They had no interest at all in finding out the background of the victims of the lynchings, finding the correct spelling of their names. Did they leave family behind? Did they have kids? What they consistently do is describe the people who are lynched as brutes, fiends, often questioned their intelligence, also often implied that they had had previous run-ins with the law. So in that way, our best sources are just a total failure. As a former newspaper reporter, I get very angry, actually, on this subject. Okay, with that caveat, let me go and we can start off. We have these fabulous maps from the time period. They're really works of art. And we're going to go to what I had been saying was Bealsville. I'm told it's actually pronounced as Bellsville. It's a couple miles north of Poolesville. Right now it's just a little intersection, but at the time it had more of a population. It was a town in Montgomery County. This is a closer look at it. So let me see. No, I got to get something out with my dates in it. I don't see him right now. But it's a January morning in 1880, a Saturday. 11-year-old girl named Ada Hayes is out milking the cows. She works for a shopkeeper and farmer named Lemuel Bell, and you see L. Bell up near the intersection in the upper right. She's out milking the cows, and he also employs a farmhand named George Peck. And as she's working, Peck comes by, passes her, and then, again, this is according to the accounts, and there's no evidence that those reporters ever talked to Ada. Peck comes and grabs Ada and drags her off into a big pile of straw where he's dug out like a cave. But Ada screams, though he tries to cover her up. And a neighbor, the Reverend C.L. Amy, who's the recently appointed Baptist preacher at the Poolesville Baptist Church, hears the screams. It happens that Reverend Amy has a gun. He comes running. Peck runs off. The Reverend Amy, who had 8 or 9 kids, I forget, we have the census for them. Reverend Amy takes Ada across the street. These locations are somewhat approximate. Takes Amy across the street, and then Amy at least goes up to Lemuel Beal's place. And what they do is they send for law enforcement. In 1880, law enforcement in Montgomery County was, I think it's about a dozen districts, 10 districts, each of which had a deputy who was also a farmer. It was a guy with a gun and no training. There's also Lemuel Beal's nephew. The County Genealogical Society has recently turned up. So after a while, here comes Officer Hugh Miles. And when, according to the accounts, when he sees the officer coming, Peck, who'd just gone back to working in the barn. I forgot to say that Peck was a former slave. He shows up in the slave census of 1867. So he was a local guy. He goes and running off into some woods, but the officer is able to get some people, and they capture him. And they take him to, this is the road, the present-day road along which this happened. The farm would be off on the right. The Reverend Amy's house might have been off on the left. That's what it looks like now. So he takes Peck off to Poolesville. And this is Poolesville. This map is 1878, but it's a pretty good idea of what the place would have looked like in 1880, as far as I know. Let's go in, zoom in a little. That's tighter. If you've ever been through Poolesville, you know this intersection. And specifically, Miles and Peck hole up in the Oddfellows Hall. Rockville, where the county jail is 17 miles away, and it's 5 in the afternoon, and it's just too far to go with a prisoner or without a prisoner at that time of day. So it's Saturday, and they hole up in the Oddfellows Hall. And the reason they're kind of hiding in there or locked in there is because crowds have begun to gather on the street. Crowds in the 1880 sense maybe being, small knots of 2 and 3 people, but it looked crowded for the time, and there was mention of lynching. There'd actually been a lynching in Point of Rocks. This is January. There'd been a lynching in Pointe aux Rocks the previous April. So they stand there till 11 o'clock at night, and Constable Miles' home was just off the map, up to the upper left. And at 11, by 11 at night, it's quiet, and they think everything's okay. It's safe to go out, and they don't want to spend the night in the Oddfellows Hall. So Miles takes his prisoner first across the street to Mr. Walter's store. This is presently a gas station. The Oddfellows Hall, that building has burnt down a couple of times, but if you go, the present-day building says International Order of Oddfellows right on the side. We cross the street to Walter's store, close the door, but there's the sound of a horse riding up and a gunshot, and the mob bursts in. The gunshot was a signal to them. They burst in, they subdue the constable, they grab Peck and throw a noose around his neck and drag him across the street, through the field, and up to that point. The reason we know pretty well where that point is as you can see, it's right across from a Presbyterian church that dates to the Civil War. And that church is still there today, and it looks pretty much the same as it did then. Once they're there, and we're probably around midnight or a little thereafter, they throw the rope over a tree. It's a locust tree, and pull Mr. Peck about 5 feet off the ground, tie off the rope to a fence, and they leave him hanging, which is an important element of these things. Once he's clearly dead, they fire a few shots at the body and disperse. But they leave the body hanging, and that's because whatever they said at the time, these were not frontier justice. Maryland is a lawless place, and we're not confident in the judiciary. This was domestic terrorism. Poolesville had a substantial black population outside it. There were African American communities, and they left the bodies hanging. They wanted to keep people in their place, though this is not what they're saying. In fact, up the street from there was a African American graveyard and schoolhouse and stuff, and I mean just up the street. So Peck's left there hanging overnight, but there's a problem, as you can imagine, on Sunday morning. This is what parking looked like at the Presbyterian Church in the 1880s and 1890s. I don't know if the church had a parking lot committee or anything, but obviously the buggies were stacked up, and it was disturbing as people start coming into church to have a body across the street. So they, somebody, maybe the constable came and cut down Mr. Peck. They buried him nearby, but within a couple of days, the local African American community had dug him up and reinterred him in, we think probably in a church graveyard, or what was going to become a church graveyard that also was just up the street. So it's very possible that Mr. Peck is buried here. What were the consequences of having a group of people murder a man in the middle of the night? Not really any. They had a inquest, coroner's inquest, maybe while the body's still hanging. I mean, at the time, they would just call people, the Justice of the Peace, who'd actually seen Peck the day before. The Justice of the Peace calls in some of the local guys. They there may have been 2 inquest juries. The first one couldn't reach a verdict. The second, and we have the names of who was in the second jury, and it's the prominent people of the time. And you would recognize these names too, because these names are still with us in Montgomery County. You either know or drive on people or roads named Offutt and Poole and Pumphrey and stuff like that. They're very familiar names even today. Second jury of inquest finds that Mr. Peck died of strangulation at the hands of parties unknown, and that's the end of it. Next up is that summer, about 6 months later, just outside Darnestown, with the, I'm sorry, I have to say, see them there. I say Shifleys. The Historical Society was telling me the correct pronunciation of the name, and I can't do it. So for our purposes, these are the Shifleys. They lived, here's the census records for them. There was James Shifley, 36. Mary or Linny Shifley, who was about 8 years older than him. She also was the one who'd bought their farm. So my sister, who couldn't make it today, and I have speculated endlessly on the relationship of these two people with 9 years difference, no children. She's the one who bought the farm. And also living with them or right next door is John Dorsey. You can see he's identified. I think that's a servant, certainly a laborer. Let me see. And here's the site of the Shifley farm today. James died in the early 1900s, and Linny left town. She wasn't from around here. She moved back to New York to live with a niece, I think, and sold off the farm. Anyway, so it's July, still 1880, the same year. What happens on a Sunday morning this time is Linny shows up Linny shows up at the neighbor's badly beaten, tells a story that her husband was out of town on business, and that Dorsey, or Diggs as the newspapers ended up calling him, came and asked for money. She said no. He ended up attacking her, dragging her to the upstairs bedroom in their little farmhouse, beating her. She escapes in the night. He drags her back. Finally, he disappears in the morning, and though badly injured, she makes it to the neighbor's house. So this story, as you can imagine, caused quite a stir, and even without email, they had no trouble communicating in Montgomery County at that time. There was a huge search for Mr. Dorsey that I think if I remember, it extended down into D.C. And here's actually that story was about him. The most intense excitement prevailed. It was well understood, they're calling him Diggs, that Diggs' capture would be immediately followed by his death. Mr. Diggs was indeed found that Monday night. He was captured by this guy who was over 70 years old. And there's a whole story on that, but instead I'm going to skip over that. You can ask me later. And this was the Montgomery County Jail. They at least got him to the jail. After the earlier guy, Zacharias, took him to the jail, Zacharias went to one of the hotels in Rockville, and though it was late at night, mentioned, that, well, we've got the guy in custody. There were soon knots of men or crowds. The numbers differ radically in the different reports here. Let's say 30 people sort of lingering outside the jail. There were also newspaper reporters because they'd missed the previous one, but here they had some advance notice. It was a really good story, and evidently people knew what was going to happen, so there were newspaper reporters who came up for it. That's the jail. Just to tie things to present day, this is the current side of the jail. It's where our county council is today. And let's put it back in 1880. There's the jail. Nothing happened for hours. The reason for that was Mr. Shifley, who had been out of town, sent word that he wanted to be present in case anything, he wanted to be present for the lynching. So they held off till 3 in the morning. Shifley shows up. They take him, they have to get into the jail. They take him to the jail and they tell, I don't remember if it's the sheriff or the jailer, here's Shifley, he wants to ID the guy you've arrested. The sheriff says, well, he can come in and do it, but the rest of you are going to have to stand back from the door. So when that ploy doesn't work, they grab the sheriff, jailers, burst into the jail and grab Mr. Dorsey. And he's manacled with his feet, but they marched him through town. They marched him through town. Yeah, that's the route out of town. The last building they would have passed is that little circled spot on the right. That was the Episcopal Rectory at the time. That house is still there. The church sold it off in the 1900s, but the last place they would have gone by was the Episcopal Rectory. They went out to West Farm. Here's a look at where that was. And there they acted out this little drama where they'd appointed a wealthy farmer, wealthy white farmer, of course, as their captain. They called him captain. And the men stood around Dorsey and piously took off their hats and prayed that Dorsey be forgiven for the evil that he had committed. And there's no sense of irony that this is a bunch of, maybe 30 guys who are fixing to murder somebody, and here they are praying that their victim be forgiven for the evil he committed. They did try and make it a less painless lynching at first by trying to put him on a horse and driving the horse off so he could drop. The horse was having none of it. So in the end, they just did the same thing, throw the rope over the tree and pull him up. And once again, leave the body hanging till the next morning. Where by one account, many of the crowd of African American people from the community were there seeing what was happening. This is the location of that incident. This is out, I think is it Maryland Avenue or 20th? It doesn't matter. If you've driven to Rockville from 270, you've driven right by this. It's a little residential area. Let me see if there's anything else I need to say about that. No, I think we'll keep going. Now there's a gap of 16 years at this point before the next lynching. And this was going to be potentially a little talk of situating St. John's and its neighborhood in relation to these, because it would be wrong to think of these as something that took place in a galaxy far away in another time that have nothing to do with us, even though most of us were not living in Montgomery County in the 1800s. But after talking to our church archivist, it turns out there's additional material on that. So there's a part 2 that's going to be coming for this forum in January. So anyway, 1896, Gaithersburg. There's the Buxton family. Unlike the others, I don't know exactly where they lived, but partly because the maps are much earlier. But that's Rockville Pike. The people underlined are the people identified as their neighbors, and just above them you can see the name of the mom's father. His, let's see, he had a blacksmith shop, right? BSSH, blacksmith shop up there. So the Buxtons lived there. It was a couple. There are 2 or 3 daughters. There's a little conflict on that, and 2-year-old son, or maybe 4-year-old son. This is what they looked like in their house from the Washington Times at the time. One of the daughters actually lived till 1990. And here's the stretch of 355 where their home would have been. So somebody was walking up 355 to work early one morning while it's still dark, and there were cries of murder, murder. And Mrs. Buxton comes running out of the house. There's blood. She's carrying one of her kids. The neighbors, as you can imagine, come rushing. They go in. Most of the members of the family have been hit in the head with an axe. Surprisingly, not immediately fatally. They're just injured, and actually the adults seem to be functioning pretty well. But by dawn, the neighbors are riding a posse looking for the suspect, and really they're looking for African American people. That's about as far as, if there was any description, that was about as far as they got. So it turns out that Mr. Buxton had been involved in the jailing of an African American guy from the community a number of years previously. He'd been convicted of a rape or something and sent to prison. He had threatened Buxton at the time, and he was actually out of jail. They actually, you would think he'd be a prime suspect, and they found George Neal. He was walking Du Bois for a baseball game. At the time, there were about 40 African-American communities scattered all over Montgomery County, and many of them, up into the 1950s, had their own baseball teams, played each other on Saturdays. Anyway, they found George Neal, arrested him, took him to our jail, and then there was another one of the posses, just a couple guys with guns. They're riding along, and they see a black man in a field, and he sees them and starts running, which, of course, is enough excuse to shoot at him and arrest him. So they captured, just because he was running, this guy, Sidney Randolph. And they also took him to the jail. The Buxton family, everybody large distances is getting around by train in Montgomery County at the time. The family's put on a train to Garfield Hospital in D.C. Sadly, the youngest injured daughter, Sadie, dies. And she's buried just right up on that stretch with the rest of her family. The sheriff fears, and even though it's 1896, the sheriff fears another lynching. He takes his two suspects, gets them out the back of that jail, and goes with them on a train to Baltimore to be kept in the jail in Baltimore for safekeeping. Meanwhile, you can imagine there's this midnight attack on this family. Who's responsible? And there's clues like bloody coats and footprints and all this. And it was the big news of the time. All kinds of stories. Lots of people following it. But many people felt they knew where it would end. The Washington Bee was the black paper in D.C. at the time, an important paper historically. The unwritten law of Maryland is that if a white person is killed and the murderer cannot be found, some Negro must hang for it. Detectives from D.C. investigate this. They think they're convinced that it's the wrong people in jail. Detectives from Baltimore. Eventually, after a few weeks, the two men have to be brought back to Rockville and for an inquest. And actually, surprisingly, George Neal, the guy with the motive, they release him. And I'll speed up a little and say, no, shoot, I'm sorry. Yeah. They go into the jail and pull him out, drag him out of the jail like a log, load him on a wagon that they brought, go off initially to the west where the previous lynching had been, but then spiral up around and end up on 355, right by Rockville Pike, a tree within a few feet of Rockville Pike, and pull him up. That site, I believe, is now Montgomery College. This gets quite an audience. After they took the body down, in fact, the crowd stripped the tree of bark and branches and cut up the rope for souvenirs. The paper said the tree looked like it had been struck by lightning. By this time, some people are objecting to lynching. The governor, there had actually been a white guy lynched up at Fort Tobacco. The governor put up a reward if the guilty parties in either case could be found. And so there was an inquest, and it actually went for several days, and they called witnesses, but nobody was very forthcoming. In fact, a couple of African Americans who were in the audience told the reporter it seemed that everybody was suffering from mind failure. Let's see. So this is pretty much the summary. It continues for a while. There's a grand jury. That's about it. Let me leave this with a slightly more upbeat note, which is that today, in present-day Montgomery County, the County Council has passed a resolution calling for a Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission. The County Historical Society, my sister and I were there Friday, is working to build authoritative accounts of what happened. And a group of activists is working to do soil collection that can be sent to the Lynching Museum. So this is the outline. There's more details if you all want, but I've run over and need to talk with Peter. If that was kind of a downer, Peter's offered to lead us. Oh, thanks. Peter's offered to lead us in a chorus of Baby Sharks at 11 o'clock.
Well, thank you, Jay. When we had our first adult forum when we had our first adult forum in September, and I went through the list of some of the forums that we would be doing, and I mentioned this one. That was the only one that we had literally audible gasps from the audience, and it is perhaps understandable because the very word lynch or lynching, it brings forth such horrible images and invokes many emotions, and I'm happy to see the turnout here today because it obviously is an important subject to this congregation. And I think your presentation, especially with the newspaper articles and photos of then and now, really bring home how this is not an abstract issue. It is an issue that really is close to home. I noticed that in the first New York Times article that you showed, it talked about the lynch law and referenced lynch mob dispensing justice. So justice in quotation marks, I think, but it does raise the question that we've been asking each of our speakers here in the adult forums this fall about justice and why we should pursue it. So let me start by asking you, sort of in the context of your work, how does that inform your view of justice and why we should pursue it?
Okay. I thought we were holding the forums to get other people's answers to this.
Well, we can open that up as well, but you go first.
Well, actually, then talk about justice. This was not it. They pretended at the time it was, but I started out by being angry at the newspaper reporters for not asking really obvious questions. Then I realized that they're telling their audience what they want to hear, and that audience and there's basic fictions underlying this whole thing that wasn't just the lynch mob, and it wasn't just the people of the inquest who came in and found nobody. We have no idea who did it. But it's readers in D.C. and Baltimore who also subscribe to a series of small fictions and one large fiction. Let me give an example of the small fiction and how it impacts, and then maybe I'll jump to the large one. The typical is every single one of those accounts says how the sheriffs or the jailers did everything in their power, and that's in that quote, did everything in their power to stop the lynching. But they didn't pull a gun. They weren't willing to shoot anybody. It was necessary for the papers to say that and have these manful depictions of sheriffs fighting and overpowered by mobs. But that's not what this was about. This was about their understanding and the reader's understanding that it was not reasonable in the defense of the rule of law to shoot a white guy when you're protecting a black guy. And that was the unquestioned understanding, and the reporters never asked, why didn't you pull a gun? It actually happened in a near lynching in South Carolina. The jailer stood behind the door, said, I'm sorry to tell you this, fellas, but the first guy who comes through that door, I'm going to have to kill. That mob went away. Didn't happen here. So that's one of the small fictions. Underlying this, I feel, is a much bigger fiction that lives on today and informs has informed our national feelings of justice, which is that people of color are inherently dangerous, and so the only thing for white society to do is to use violence preemptively. And we can follow that from this time, follow it up through history, go through mass incarceration, go to comments about super predators, and tune in today where you have a top elected official saying that immigrants are murderers and rapists, and the conclusion that then it's perfectly okay to take Mexican children and put them in cages. It's the same logic, and that is informing, I think, the national understanding of justice. We're still buying it.
And well, thank you. And I think that that leads me to my next question, which is that this has been extremely educational for us, and this is a congregation that is very interested in history and what we can learn from history in terms of our actions today. So what do you think after this presentation today? What can we do with this when we leave here?
You know, working on this and then understanding the context of these has really changed my understanding of Montgomery County. When I moved here, that Confederate statue outside the City Hall was an oddity. Now that I understand it in context, really sort of a surprise that they moved it. So I hope that people, I mean, we're going to get more into the present day, that people can question a little more the way things are today. And I also, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I've also brought the EJI Montgomery is having a soil collection out in Poolsville next Sunday that I'm not involved in organizing, but I brought a sheet with their information if you're really interested in this and want to see the first soil collection at a lynching site in Montgomery County. Save some time next week.
I was struck by the fact that the newspaper articles in respect to the first two lynchings were from the New York Times, right? Were there, in your research, were there local papers that
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Most of those, I think I used actually the New York Times twice.
Right.
And I did them mainly so I could dump on them for their reuse of that headline. But yes, the Montgomery County Sentinel, I don't know if I showed something from them, but they were a weekly. They covered it, and even if they get some things wrong, I depended on them. I figured they could get the locations right because they lived here. The Baltimore Sun was really the big paper, multiple papers in Washington, and it's been fascinating to read and compare.
Well, let me just ask you one more question before we go to the audience. When you and I were preparing for this, we did talk about lynchings in the Bible. And some of your research there, and could you talk about some of those examples?
Okay, I get to ask. Okay, in the New Testament, I'll say that there are two lynchings. Who's gonna name one? Is this okay? I gotta ask.
Absolutely.
Who's gonna raise their hand on a lynching in the New Testament or lynchings in the New Testament? There we go. Saint Stephen.
Saint Stephen.
Yes. Thank you so much. St. Stephen, you may remember, was stoned while the future Paul held people's coats. And you may not think of it right away because it's not a hanging, but so many people here have done the pilgrimage, and we all know that in Jerusalem, Palestine, that they have a shortage of trees, but they have no shortage of rocks. And I'll cut ahead to the other one, which is the adulterous woman, where Jesus manages to stop it. I would count, yeah, that would be extrajudicial killing. Interestingly, Jesus' crucifixion, even though it was clearly domestic terrorism, wouldn't count, as we discussed, because he had he had more due process than most people at the time.
Right, and so clearly the circumstances were different, but are there some parallels you can draw between the lynchings of those times and the ones we're talking about?
You know, what I would wish would be that these were, the mobs were church-going people. Everybody went to church. And the first story involves 3 of the churches there. I wish somebody there had said what could have pointed out that story. But, okay, let he who is without sin pull on that rope. If they just could have brought him back, just challenged them a little bit. Parallels, yeah, it sounds a lot like.
All right. Well, why don't we open it up to questions from our audience?
We have a guest mic handler,
Yes.
which is our predecessor, Lisa, who did wonderful forums for... sorry.
Thank you, Jay, for your research. It's so impressive, and I appreciate what you did. So sometime I'd like you to say how you're going to, what you're going to turn this into. Will we be able to buy a book? Will you publish it someplace? But really my first question is not that, but it is, you know how we read that racism in a way got worse and worse as we moved into the 20th century, Jim Crow, so forth. There were terrible instances, especially right after World War I, all across the country. And so were there any other manifestations that you know of in Montgomery County in the 20th century?
I don't know of any lynchings. That doesn't mean there weren't any. Are there other manifestations of racism in Montgomery County? Yes, absolutely. After the turn of the century, and I'm not talking about spray painting and stuff. I'm talking about things that involve our area. As for what I'm doing with it real quick, Nancy, so this summer I got a grant from the Arts and Humanities Commission to make a short documentary on it. So y'all are getting kind of a preview of that.
Jay, thank you for your fine research. That's really extraordinary. I was curious on whether you had actually, or planned to get to the local African American community. I'm really curious on how that history has been handed down, or if it has been in that, in that community, oral history or any,
History about the lynchings?
Yeah, and the knowledge of it, if that was been passed on, and what is, if that's a resource of some sort.
Yeah, I would love to know, and after visiting the graveyard, we may have, I didn't want to do this project because everybody's dead, and everybody who's there is dead. And as a filmmaker, I'm used to talking to people. So yes, and we may have a lead there, but I'm so worried that there's just not going to be, because people, we know from the much more recent ones in the 1930s in Maryland that people just didn't talk about it. They cut it off. In fact, one of the papers on the Eastern Shore, the day following a lynching, just printed a little notice that basically said, we all know what happened yesterday. We are going to put it aside and get past it. And that was it. So yes, I would love to be able to do that.
Thanks, Jay, for doing this. Lest we conclude that these are three isolated incidents in an otherwise wise and fair society in Montgomery County at the time, I think it might be worth pointing out that the first two deaths in the Civil War occurred in Baltimore when federal troops that were intended to relieve Washington were attacked by the mobs as they went from one station to another. The mayor of Baltimore was, in fact, a secessionist. Closer to home, or maybe Maryland and Montgomery County, Lincoln appeared on the ballot in Maryland, unlike 9 states. There were 4 candidates in 1860. He finished last, drawing 50 votes in all of Montgomery County. When Montgomery County passed a resolution regarding secession in Rockville, they said that they thought that the county and the state should stay with the Union as long as the war wasn't being fought to free the slaves. These are not isolated incidents. They reflect an undercurrent in Montgomery County at the time. Just thought I'd offer that for whatever people thought it was worth.
Thank you so much, Earl.
I have a quick question, and thank you again for your research on this. based on the language that you highlight in the newspaper reports from Washington, Baltimore, even New York City, it seems unlikely that there were only 3 lynchings, because the language seems to refer to generally understood ideas that, for example, if someone's murdered, you can't find someone's going to hang for it. So then my question is, why do you think you've only been able to find 3 accounts? Were other ones things that happened but weren't covered, or what?
So the best person to answer that question would be a guy named Tony Cohen, who's a Montgomery County historian, African American, and I understand he's trying to track down others. As far as the New York Times, there was evidently a near lynching in DC, there were in PG, a little bit in Frederick, so their reference, and then you can go south, their reference seems somewhat to have been, to the whole area, not just Montgomery County.
Thank you.
How did the lynchings occur, please?
I'm sorry, Megan?
How did the lynchings occur?
How?
Yeah.
In what way?
Like, how did they form? Yes.
Yeah, come together, yeah. So people knew what was going on, and I'm not familiar with how the telegraph and telephone and railroad, what order and timing they were brought into Montgomery County. Certainly by the time of the 3rd one, they had telephones and people were talking. It was exciting. People were looking for excitement, and they would just turn up on the street to see what was going to happen. They also clearly coordinated. Certainly with the 3rd one, there was planning and coordination. They had weeks. This was not grab somebody the day after an offense. They had weeks to plan it, and I don't have access to any accounts of how exactly they planned that kind of stuff.
Jay, just to maybe...
Does that help? Does that work? Okay.
Maybe to bend this, hopefully to a slightly more positive note, I wonder if you can reflect on, the trends now. I mean, you mentioned the Confederate Museum the Confederate statue in Rockville, the museum in Montgomery, Alabama. From your research and from your conversations, thinking about progress towards reconciliation, I wonder if you can just reflect on that a little bit. And are we making progress? Is there signs that we're putting this legacy behind us from your research?
Thanks for the question, Bill. The first step to that would be recognition of what happened. I think John Ross said he was talking to people and nobody knows about this. So reconciliation to me looks really far off. What I'm involved in is putting the facts out there so that people are aware of what happened. Certainly that's what they're doing at the Historical Society right now, and certainly that's going to get some resistance. Imagine if you're a private homeowner and somebody wants to put a historical plaque out in front, or put it any place in Montgomery County, So that's as far as I can go. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in this. I certainly hope that's where it's leading.
For those who are interested in sort of this whole question of how people didn't speak out, there's a NPR podcast called White Lies, and it's a podcast done by 2 young Alabama journalists who have gone back and tried to research what really happened to James Reeb, who was the pastor who had been at All Souls Unitarian Church here in Washington for many years, who joined the civil rights movement, went down and got killed. And to this day, All Souls has a very active voter registration program that they run. But they went back 50 years later to try to figure out who really killed James Reeb, what really happened. And this whole series of podcasts, I think there are 8 or 10 sections of it, go through how they tried to dig into the story and follow different leads. And basically it was people, they all knew what had happened, they just wouldn't talk about it. And there were people who wouldn't talk about it until perpetrators had died, things like that. But it's really an interesting examination of, even 50 years later, people can't talk about it. And yet these young reporters who are from the area are really trying to dig for reconciliation, to begin to try to get that acknowledgement. So I highly recommend it to you who are interested.
On there's been some other reporting on cases like that. I need to listen to those. Just on the subject of white lies, when my sister and I were at the Historical Society, we pulled up next to, there's the city of Rockville did a African American Heritage Walk. You can download it and stuff. And there's also placards. And there's no mention of the jail. There's no mention of the lynchings. We pulled up next to one of the placards, and it talked about the Bell sisters, or Beale sisters, how they lived there. They had a couple dozen enslaved people. And then it talks about how really nice they were, that they didn't sell off the slave children. They just sent them to work in D.C. And this is supposed to mitigate talking about the fact that there were enslaved people there. I turned to my sister, and this is a pretty recent plaque, and I said, what is this? They didn't sell them off, they just rented them, the children, to people in D.C. This is supposed to make us feel better about the whole thing, but it's clear that the person who wrote that plaque felt that it should.
So just a tiny bit of hope. I think part of the answer is process in solving who our triers of fact are. And the good news is that a Supreme Court justice from Montgomery County, not my favorite, but Judge Kavanaugh just ruled and upheld that it is in no way at all allowable for a prosecutor to strike African Americans on basis of race. And while it's pathetic that it was 2019 that this was decided, it was at least decided and addressed in a very, very long decision. But if only in defining your trier of fact as a true peer and as a person of African American descent or Hispanic, or can the answer be found? And we're making a little bit of progress. It was a Mississippi case that was just horrific.
Pretty egregious case.
Yeah. Horrendous. But at least, and it was kind of nice that Judge Kavanaugh wrote it, and it's a great opinion, and I have it if anyone wants to read it. So, something.
Well, thank you. Well, do we have time for one more? Perhaps let's do one more.
Hi, Jay. Thank you.
Hey.
This was very interesting. My organization had a national meeting in Montgomery last April, and we attended the memorial on lynching, which is very moving. It's only 2 hours drive from Atlanta. I would highly recommend going for any of you to go there, take your children. It also has a museum on mass incarceration, which is very related. And what they're doing there is, I think they've tripled the amount of visitors in the last 2 years. And I think it's a really, really excellent place to visit.
Oh, thank you.
Well, and I know...
I don't think that they have Montgomery County. I was there. I searched for Montgomery County.
No, that's what the soil collection is about Sunday.
They didn't have... They have Maryland. What? They have Maryland, but they don't have Montgomery County.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jay.
Right.